In the battery industry, plenty of breakthroughs come along, but very few of those are more than just some data on a spreadsheet. Not so with 10-9 Technologies, who are dedicated to developing new materials for new economies. Our next presenter has an extensive background in inorganic synthesis and nanoanalysis to a quixotic quest, changing the world from nanoscale up by thinking differently about the electroactive materials that power it. Please help me welcome founder and inventor at 10-9 Technologies, Paige Johnson.
In September of this year, we announced at the Battery Show in Novi, Michigan, in conjunction with the BIC, that we had achieved for the first time in the world fossil fuel parity in a battery material at 12,584 watt-hours per kilogram in the full cell. We are fundamentally a materials company. I'm a chemist. We have a group of synthetic chemists, and we were founded on the premise that today's materials won't take us to tomorrow's future. With all due respect to all the engineers in this room, you can't engineer your way past a bad material, right? But you can't add a level of engineering that will simply give you more electrons from the reactions that are taking place in the battery. You can utilize them more effectively, but you can't engineer beyond that fundamental basis of the chemistry. And so we were really founded with the ideas of addressing some of the major problems that need to be addressed and can only be addressed through finding new materials that behave in new ways. There were a couple of ideas that we started with that I think are important to our discussion. One is that we would only work in what I call the friendly areas of the periodic table. I just felt like fundamentally there was so much interesting chemistry to investigate that there was really no need to go to highly toxic systems or heavy metals or things that were terribly, terribly rare or any of that. The other motivation was that every material that we synthesized that was new, we would test for all the major problems of the world, one of those being batteries. And so every new material that we made, we tested for its capability in a battery system, as well as its photoresponsiveness, as well as its catalytic nature. And my background is fundamentally in catalysis. But in terms of batteries, the battery industry just faces a fundamental problem, in my view as a chemist, that is, I think, often not brought up in this kind of constant engineering discussion we have around what batteries are and what they do. And it's a first principles problem. And that is that fundamentally, we're trying to achieve energy density with materials that are not energy dense. And I'm not the first person to say this. Stanley Whittingham is well known for saying repeatedly that we really have not advanced energy density in any significant way since the invention of the intercalation electrodes in the 1970s. And since then, no material has really moved beyond 5% active atoms. And that's not an energy dense material. So how do you solve that? The only answer that addresses the first principles problem is to simply make more atoms available for reaction. That's the only answer. And yet the battery industry has really been focused not on making more atoms available for interaction, but perhaps on being able to utilize those atoms in new ways. And so the focus has continually been, from the perspective of a chemist, on using crystallographic techniques to achieve higher and higher voltages. We decided to take another approach, another look at the wattage equation, and we decided to look at surface chemistry to increase capacity, leaving voltage where it lay with the materials that we began with, and using only fundamentally friendly and non-toxic materials. So another way to think of this first principle problem is if you look at the kind of the cathode that's existed in the industry today at 750 watt-hours per kilogram, intercalation cathodes in general have only 5% of active atoms. But if you look at gasoline, in the combustion of gasoline, in an ideal state, virtually 100% of those atoms are available for reaction. And so it's not surprising that you achieve a result with much greater energy in it, of something like 12,889 watt-hours per kilogram. And just in the most hand-waving of senses, right, making all the simplified assumptions that we can, you can see that those numbers are simply related to that fundamental difference in availability of atoms. And that's what we sought to address. These dots that are now appearing on the screen for you represent basically a year of our research batch samples. Most of those were taken here at the BIC or assembled at the BIC. Because we consider ourselves a materials science company and a company of chemists, we're very focused on the synthetic side of our operations, and with a classic startup model, we decided that we would outsource the capital-intensive pieces of the process, which is making the devices and testing the devices, to third-party laboratories. So one of whom is the BIC. So all our cells are made and tested elsewhere. We don't do that in-house. We only do the synthesis in-house. And you can see here, that's kind of a year's worth of research samples, basically August to August. Using our principles of focusing on the surface science and the ability to increase capacity rather than on the crystallinity and trying to use that to increase voltage, you can see that very readily we were above kind of standard cathodes like NMC. That was really easy to do, actually, and we were able to do that quite readily. But in about 6 months, we were also beyond the capacity of, say, the lithium-sulfur system. And you can see that the red dots kind of beginning to float up above those lines. And we just kept following the science. And quickly, again, we're beyond the capabilities of silicon and graphene, as published in the literature recently. Some of you may have seen, I think last week, there was a release from Samsung about some graphene-based balls that they were maintaining for their batteries. And we plotted our data against theirs and sent that right back to Samsung. And then we were beyond, in kind of the last 6 months, even what I consider to be the unicorn of the battery industry, the lithium-air battery, which is much talked about but rarely seen in real life. And then finally, we had reached fossil fuel parity with gasoline. And it's really interesting because I like to tell this story because it's something that really isn't even talked about in the battery industry, that these sorts of energy densities are possible. And we achieved these both at the BIC laboratory and in another laboratory that we use on the East Coast. And I kind of didn't say anything to any of the personnel until they'd each done it about 10 times. And then I called them up and I said, okay, you know, are these numbers real? Do you have any reason to believe that these numbers aren't real? And they all said, no, you know, we're convinced that they're real. And I said, you know, in all the customers you've worked with, have you ever seen numbers like these before? And the answer was, no, we've never seen any numbers approaching this before. And then my final question was, you guys realize this is fossil fuels, don't you? And it was like nobody had even taken that on board. And I myself, when I first started getting the numbers back in the kind of 12,000 range, I have a background in the oil industry, being from Oklahoma. And that was my first job as a scientist, was in the oil patch. And you know, when I first saw that I was in the 12,000 range, I actually went to Wikipedia and looked it up just to make sure that in fact, yeah, there it was, 12,889 gasoline watt-hours per kilogram, and we were at 12,584. And we've done this by simply following that fundamental principle of making more and more and more of the atoms available for reaction. In the time span represented by those red dots, we also filed 19 patents and scaled up the process so that now we can produce enough for about 100,000 1-amp-hour cells per month. So it is a process that is scalable. Obviously, we've reached energy density parity with fossil fuels, but how do we do on kind of the other important parameters of the battery? It's not, I think it makes sense that having re-envisioned how the basic battery materials work, having moved all the reactivity at the surface, we also have very high rate capabilities. We can charge and discharge at up to 10C. We've achieved 900 plus cycles without mechanical failure. It's a drop-in manufacturing system that requires no formation. The battery is ready to use as assembled. And it is safe to nail penetration, over voltage, and direct short. Has a stable temperature performance from 5 to 70 degrees C. At 5, of course, the electrolyte systems begin to fail, and we're currently looking into a cold electrolyte system that will enable us to go even colder. And we have no indication of self-discharge. And these are materials that, as I said, are fundamentally friendly, cobalt-free, so eliminate the problems of the toxicity and the geopolitical issues of cobalt. And so what we are saying now to potential partners that have gotten in touch with us after the battery show and to all of you in this room is, what could you do with a battery with this level of performance? What different use cases does that create for you? What devices now become perhaps primary powered rather than rechargeable? It doesn't make, for instance, battery swappability a better use case for internally combustion-powered vehicles and that sort of thing. So now that you have a battery that essentially does have the same energy in it as a gas tank. We see ourselves, as Ben said, at a technology readiness level of about a 6. We can produce in high quantities. And we're currently looking at discussions with a variety of partners to take us to the next level of application-specific result rather than generalized battery results. So if you're one of those people and you have a novel thing that you think you could do with a fossil fuel parity equivalent battery, I'd love to talk to you. Thanks for your attention.